after their victory in the Philippines, the Japanese are going to engage in a war strategy known as island hopping, which is kind of like hopscotch. You're going to jump around to all the different islands in the Pacific and try to take them over. It's kind of guessing. You don't always go to every single island. There's thousands. It would be hard. So you have to guess and be preemptive. Where will the Americans come next? Where will the Americans come next? Let's hedge them off before they get there. They also wanted to obviously gain some of the larger islands for land, for resources, all those types of things. And so the Japanese are going to attack New Guinea and Australia in what's called the Battle of the Coral Sea. The Battle of the Coral Sea is, I should say the first naval battle, sorry, where ships of either side never saw each other. We were able to fight this far enough away using, our strategic weaponry in our battleships that we did have left, as well as those that Australia had. Where we are going to launch longer range missiles and torpedoes, as well as the airplanes. And ultimately, our USS Lexington is going to be sunk, and the USS Yorktown is going to be severely damaged. But the Japanese lost a lot of ships, and this actually is going to stop them from being able to conquer Australia, which is obviously fairly significant. And it's the first time that the Japanese have seen a defeat at this point. Normally in class we would do a simulation that we'll probably do in a couple of days. The next of the major battles in the Pacific is going to be our watershed battle, the Battle of Midway Island. After losing the Battle of the Coral Sea, the Japanese were somewhat humiliated, and so they decided they were going to conquer the island of Midway because this would allow them to have a staging ground to then go after all of Hawaii, which would then allow them to go into all of the U.S. So for them, strategically, it was next in line for the hopscotch mission. For us, it was obviously strategic to prevent them from getting to the Hawaiian Islands. And so this is going to be a huge battle. The Yorktown, after being so badly damaged in the Coral Sea, is going to be sunk in this battle. However, all four of the Japanese aircraft carriers are going to be sunk, and this is going to be such a blow to the Japanese Navy that they're now not going to be able to recover. They relied on their carriers because then their airplanes could go and do their kamikaze and banzai missions. So this really hurt the Japanese to the point where we are now on the offensive in the war, and that's why I call it a watershed. It allows us to be the ones going after them instead of having to always defend and choose. This is a picture of the Yorktown before it sunk, and then this is the Battle of Midway. You can see, tiny little island. It's not like it's going to gain the Japanese a ton of land, but enough land to be strategic, and that's the point. So speaking of land, we now shift our attention back to the happenings in the Western Front. Because really, we have a lot of different fronts in this war now, right? We've got the Pacific, we call it a theater. You got the Pacific Theater, which is us mostly against the Japanese doing all this island hopping. And then you have the Atlantic Theater, which is the European and African side of the war. So, back to the Atlantic Theater for a little bit. After the Battle of Britain, the Nazis, they had felt humiliated at losing that. They had got themselves pinned in Operation Barbarossa. So they're going to start looking for places that they can conquer because they kind of need a morale boost. So they're going to conquer Albania, not very significant. And then they decided, okay, we need to go after something that's actually pretty significant and to get us oil. Like, part of why we went into Russia was to get oil. We lost in Russia. We still need oil, right? For the tanks, for the planes, for the boats, all these things. So the Germans decided that they wanted the Suez Canal. If you'll recall, we had let the British keep it when Rommel met off against, with the Italians against the British and Egyptians. Here, the Nazis have changed their mind and have decided, okay, we need the Suez Canal because this gets us easier access to the Middle East for the oil fields. And then maybe we just conquer the Middle East while we're there. This is the Nazi mentality. And so Rommel is going to once again launch a series of attacks. He's the Desert Fox up here. And this time the British are going to have a commander by the name of Bernard Montgomery. Montgomery is a very intelligent man, and he realizes that this is going to be a fairly significant battle. It becomes known as the Battle of El Alamein. It's going to be pretty much many of the African countries, Britain, a little bit of America, a little bit of Australia going to jump in because they always like to help their friends, the British. A little bit Canadians, right? Whole bunch of allies versus this tiny little contingent of Rommel and a couple of Italians. The battle starts in Egypt, although it's going to spread across much of northern Africa. And to the Africans, this is their battle to make sure to keep the Nazi presence out of their continent. So it is a continental battle for most of Africa. Therefore, it is a huge battle that ultimately is going to cost the Germans the war and wind up in a huge defeat for them in the battle itself. The reason I argue that they lose the war at this point, because they don't gain the canal, they can't get the water passage they need to the Middle East, so they can't get the oil. They are so desperate they're going to try to use submarines in this war and launch ballistic missiles in that regard. So it's one of the first times that's ever used in warfare. However, it's just not a success. The Germans are way outnumbered. The Africans know their continent far better than anybody else. Montgomery was very intelligent. It's not to say Rommel didn't try his best. He did. But it was a huge defeat. It's also watershed because the Allies winning this battle gives the Allies a way to start looking at an invasion of Italy to get rid of Mussolini. Let's get rid of one of the major fascists. If we conquer Mussolini in Italy, then we're able to take over all of his colonies and start, chipping away at everything that the fascists and the axis of evil controlled in Europe. Here's a map of the Battle of El Alamein. You can see how many different countries were involved on the Allies' side versus the Italians mixed with some of the Germans. Germany still needed oil. And that meant they only had one option, and that was back to Russia. They're just yo-yoing now. They're going to abandon Leningrad, and they're going to turn their attention to another city closer to the oil fields, this one of Stalingrad. Stalingrad was really near the Caucasus oil fields in the south. Hitler is going to send 300,000 soldiers, not actually a very large contingency in comparison to earlier maneuvers. The Russians, they were there, they were ready, they were waiting, right? They were desperate, they were angry. 200,000 of Hitler's 300,000 soldiers were killed by the Russians. 90,000 of the remaining 100,000 became prisoners of war. So that is a fairly huge decrease for the German army. Of the 90,000 who became prisoners of war, 3,000 will eventually get their freedom in 1954 after Joseph Stalin has died. But that being said, this is a huge watershed because it prevents the Germans from getting the last opportunity they had for oil. It severely decreases the number of troops as well as the morale for the Germans. This is a huge blow to their morale. And it forces the Germans to slowly start retreating back to Berlin. So Stalin's idea of let's get England involved and do this zit-pinch movement where we can make Germany fight on this two-front war, with us winning at El Alamein, it's now a three-front war for the Germans because they have to protect the south, east, and west of their country. So they are getting attacked from all sides. And that just shows you approximately where Stalingrad is. In terms of our relationship with Russia, the U.S. and the USSR, we didn't really like each other, but once we saw that the USSR was willing to fight, against Hitler, and we didn't like Hitler, we kind of had that whole enemy and my enemy is my friend mentality. We're like, well, you know what, lesser of two evils. We're going to work together for this war. We'll see where things land afterwards, but for now, let's just team up and defeat Hitler. You've got Churchill on your side, and we actually liked Churchill. So we're going to create what's called the Lend-Lease Act, where we lent or leased a whole bunch of supplies to the Allies, mostly Russia and England. the quote was that we did the supplying while the Soviets did the dying, right? We sent over tons of materials that the Soviets then used to distract 90% of the Axis troops. So really, the US and the British were only fighting about 10% of the Axis troops, of the German troops. The rest were being engaged by the Soviets. So the Lend-Lease Act was significant because without that, the possibility is that the Russians wouldn't have been able to engage such a huge number. We basically passed the Lend-Lease Act for three main reasons. One is the firehouse analogy. It's the idea that if your friend's house, if your neighbor's house is on fire, you usually offer some kind of assistance, hoping partially that the fire doesn't spread to your land, but also because it's the altruistic type of thing to do. So in this case, Europe was on fire, quote unquote, and we wanted to make sure that the fire didn't spread to the US. This is really where we've established ourselves to be an arsenal of democracy. We had kind of played with that idea various other times throughout the history, but now we're actually going to actively engage on that. It is our goal to preserve democracy wherever it is in the world that democracy might be threatened. And we obviously had a historic friendship with Britain, lots of history there, and we wanted to try to help them out because of this historic relationship. And so the first thing that we did with the Lend-Lease Act was lend the British 50 destroyers. It's important to note Britain has officially paid back all of its debts from the Lend-Lease Act. So good job, Britain. There's always that. In terms of Americans at home, this was actually, it sounds weird, but it was kind of a popular war. Initially, most of us were isolationists. Most Americans didn't really want to get involved with foreign efforts. We viewed it as like, these civil wars or this weird conquest that we didn't know much about. It's estimated that no more than 1/3 of Americans were interventionists, people who wanted to get involved. That being said, the number one interventionist happened to be president of the time, FDR. So FDR, he wanted us in the war. He thought it would help our economy. He thought that we had a moral imperative to be there. So even before Pearl Harbor, he actually institutes the 1940 Selective Service Act, which is reintroducing military draft and conscription. He started trying to slowly build our military because he wanted us involved. He didn't necessarily, want us to go and start a conflict, but he's like, at some point, we're probably going to need to jump in, so let's start getting ourselves ready. That's why a lot of people argued that he knew the Pearl Harbor attack, something like it was going to happen, and he allowed it to, as a means of swaying public opinion to get us involved. Because after Pearl Harbor, most Americans were ready to go to war. And that's, a conspiracy theory, and obviously there's some merit to it. It'd be kind of sad to think that he knew American lives might be lost in an attack. Maybe he just didn't have the specifics. We'll probably never know for sure. But the fact is that he won us in the war before Pearl Harbor. After Pearl Harbor, he's able to get us into the war. And having used the Selective Service Act, we have the military presence to do so. As the men went off to war, the women are going to take the jobs that the men used to have. These are factory jobs, mostly making things towards the war effort. Many women were hesitant at first and scared of their own abilities to do this, and so the government creates this campaign called Rosie the Riveter of this woman that you see here. It's kind of a propaganda cartoon. But it was used to convince women, hey, you do have the strength and the fortitude to leave your houses and to go get these jobs. And this allowed the families to have an income that allowed them to have more spending power. So greater demand for employees, greater demand for jobs, greater amount of money. The Great Depression comes to an end. World War II ends the Great Depression. And that's pretty significant.